In the marble halls of Boston Superior Court, where justice was supposed to be blind, Anwin Callaway had learned to make herself invisible. For 15 years, she had perfected the art of being overlooked. The quiet court clerk who handed documents to lawyers who never met her eyes, fetched water for jurors who never thanked her, and witnessed corruption that no one else dared to see. Today, that invisibility would finally serve its purpose. The mahogany doors swung open as Judge Harrison Whitfield entered, with practiced arrogance, his robes billowing behind him like the cape of a man who believed himself untouchable. The packed courtroom rose in unison, but Whitfield's eyes swept past the assembled crowd without acknowledging the woman who had spent over a decade documenting his crimes. Anwin stood among the court staff, unremarkable in her severe gray suit and tightly pulled hair, clutching a small flash drive that contained 15 years of carefully gathered evidence. Hidden beneath her modest exterior was the truth that would destroy one of Massachusetts's most respected judges and finally bring justice for her murdered sister. The case being heard today was Commonwealth versus Parnell, another domestic violence hearing where a wealthy defendant's money would likely speak louder than his victim's bruises. Anwin had seen this pattern countless times before. Rich men walked free while their victims suffered in silence, dismissed by a system designed to protect power rather than people. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harrison Whitfield," the bailiff announced, though Anwin knew there was nothing honorable about the man taking the bench. Sorcha Parnell, 35 and trembling despite her attempts at composure, took the witness stand. Fading bruises peeked from beneath her collar as she began recounting the night her wealthy husband had thrown her down the stairs. Across the courtroom, Theo Parnell sat with the relaxed posture of a banking heir accustomed to buying his way out of consequences. "Miss Parnell," Judge Whitfield interrupted with practiced condescension, "if things were truly so dangerous, why didn't you leave sooner?" The question hit like a slap, and Anwin's hands trembled as she took notes, a rare break in the professional composure she'd maintained for 15 years. She had heard those same dismissive words before, directed at another woman who had trusted the system to protect her. Her sister Tamsin. As Whitfield's ruling surprised no one, case dismissed for insufficient evidence, Anwin watched Sorcha collapse into her attorney's arms. Their eyes met briefly across the courtroom, and Anwin's filled with an intensity that contradicted her meek appearance. "You," Whitfield called out as he gathered his robes, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who had never learned most people's names. "Tomorrow's the Barstow hearing. Make sure everything is in order, Anne." 15 years. And he still didn't know her name. But that was about to change. Tonight, the invisible woman would step into the light and Judge Harrison Whitfield would finally face the consequences of believing himself above the law. The modest apartment on the outskirts of Boston revealed nothing of Anwin Callaway's true purpose to casual observers. But behind a sliding bookcase, hidden from view, was a wall that told a different story entirely. Photos, documents, and red connecting threads created a constellation of evidence, all centered around one man, Judge Harrison Whitfield. Newspaper clippings dated back 15 years. Court transcripts highlighted and annotated in meticulous detail. Bank statements pinned alongside vacation photos of Whitfield on yachts he shouldn't have been able to afford on a judge's salary. The pattern was undeniable to anyone willing to see it. Domestic violence cases involving wealthy defendants consistently dismissed. Evidence mysteriously excluded. Victims silenced. Anwin added Sorcha Parnell's case file to the wall, then touched a faded photograph of a young woman with her same eyes and determined smile. "I'm getting closer, Tamsin," she whispered to the image. The transformation had begun 15 years ago, the day after Judge Whitfield dismissed her sister's domestic violence case against Elliot Greenfield, a banking executive with connections throughout Boston's elite circles. 6 months later, Tamsin was dead. Multiple blunt force trauma, the medical examiner had written with clinical detachment. That night, Anwin Cartwright had ceased to exist. She changed her appearance, took her mother's maiden name, and began the long process of infiltrating the very system that had failed her sister. Court clerk positions required background checks, but nobody looked too closely at quiet women with impeccable organizational skill. For 15 years, she had perfected her invisibility. She arrived early, stayed late, and made herself indispensable while remaining unnoticed. She learned the patterns, the connections, the unspoken agreements that kept corrupt judges in power and wealthy criminals free. The evidence wall revealed the scope of Whitfield's corruption, offshore accounts that correlated with case dismissals, private meetings with defense attorneys that violated every judicial ethics rule, a network of complicity that reached into the district attorney's office, the state ethics committee, and beyond. 3 months ago, she had finally identified the keystone that would bring it all down. The Barstow. Lucienne Barstow's divorce from her politically ambitious ex-husband involved allegations of financial misconduct that connected directly to Whitfield's offshore accounts. If she could expose that connection publicly, the entire network would unravel. Anwin moved to her computer and opened the court scheduling system, one of the many responsibilities that made her invisible but invaluable. With careful keystrokes, she ensured that her own workplace harassment lawsuit would land on Judge Whitfield's docket for next week's hearing. The trap was set. Whitfield's arrogance would be his downfall. He would never suspect that the mouse court clerk filing a nuisance lawsuit was actually the predator who had been stalking him for 15 years. She returned to Tamsin's photograph, her sister's smile frozen in time, forever young, forever trusting in a justice that had never come. Soon, Anwin promised. Soon he'll pay for what he did to you, to all of us. The invisible woman prepared to step into the light. District Attorney Marcus Porter leaned back in his leather chair, his expression shifting from polite interest to barely concealed annoyance as Anwin Callaway sat across from his imposing desk. She had dressed carefully for this meeting, slightly more professional than her usual courthouse attire, but still unremarkable enough to maintain her carefully cultivated invisibility. Miss Callaway, Porter glanced at her business card without really seeing it. You mentioned evidence of judicial misconduct involving Judge Whitfield. Yes. Anwin placed a carefully prepared folder on his desk, her voice steady despite knowing how this would likely end. I've been documenting a pattern of case dismissals that correlate with financial deposits to accounts linked to the judge. Porter flipped through the documents with increasing impatience, his initial politeness evaporating as he realized the scope of what she was alleging. Bank records, case files, communication logs, years of meticulous investigation condensed into undeniable evidence. And you are a court clerk. His tone carried the dismissive edge she had expected. Yes, for 15 years. In Judge Whitfield's courtroom, specifically for the past 8 years. Porter closed the folder and slid it back toward her with the finality of a man who had made his decision before truly considering the evidence. Miss Callaway, do you understand the seriousness of these accusations? Judge Whitfield has served this community for 30 years. He's one of the most respected legal minds in Massachusetts. The evidence speaks for itself. Anwin replied, her voice remaining calm despite the familiar frustration building in her chest. People are being hurt by his decision. Women are dying because... Look, Porter interrupted, his tone patronizing in a way that made her skin crawl. I appreciate your civic-mindedness, but these claims require extraordinary proof, which you simply don't have. These connections you're trying to make are circumstantial at best. The dismissive pat on her shoulder felt like a brand. Perhaps you should focus on your actual job duties rather than playing detective. Over the following week, Anwin tried every avenue she could think of. Anonymous tips to 3 different journalists who specialized in corruption investigations. None responded. A formal complaint through the court system's internal channels resulted in her supervisor calling her into his office the next day. Anwin, there's been a staffing adjustment, he announced with the uncomfortable air of a man delivering an ultimatum. We need someone with your attention to detail in the records department. The basement. A clear demotion and warning wrapped in bureaucratic language. I see, she replied, her face revealing nothing while her mind calculated the implications. You start tomorrow. Clean out your desk today. As she packed her few personal items into a cardboard box, Anwin felt the weight of the system's protection closing around Whitfield like armor. They would shield him, discredit her, and bury the truth in the same basement where they intended to bury her career. But what they didn't understand was that she had been preparing for this moment for 15 years. The demotion wasn't a punishment, it was an opportunity. The basement records department was a fluorescent lit maze of filing cabinets and bankers' boxes, where dust collected on decades of court proceedings and forgotten cases. Most employees avoided assignment here. It was where careers went to die, where problem employees were hidden away until they quietly resigned. For Anwin, it was an unexpected treasure trove. With minimal supervision and vague directives about organizing the archives, she was free to explore decades of judicial decisions with the methodical precision that had made her invaluable upstairs. Box after box revealed patterns that would have remained hidden if anyone else had been doing this work. On her 3rd day, while reorganizing a section of case files from 15 years prior, her hands froze mid-motion. The label on a sealed file made her blood run cold. Anwin Callaway versus Elliot Greenfield. With trembling fingers she opened the file that contained the official record of her sister's final desperate attempt to escape an abusive marriage. Court transcripts showed the domestic violence allegations against Elliot Greenfield, the banking executive with connections throughout Boston's power structure. Judge Whitfield had presided over the case. His ruling, dismissed for insufficient evidence. The same word, the exact same dismissive language he had used with Sorcha Parnell just days ago. A death certificate was included in the file. Anwin Callaway, deceased 6 months after the dismissal. Cause of death, multiple blunt force trauma. The police investigation had been perfunctory. The death ruled a tragic accident despite the obvious signs of prolonged abuse. But it was the financial records buried deeper in the file that made Anwin's hands clench into fists. A deposit of $50,000 to one of Whitfield's offshore accounts, made 3 days after he dismissed Anwin's case. Elliot Greenfield's signature on the transfer authorization. Her sister's life had been worth $50,000 to the man who was supposed to protect. Anwin made copies of every page before returning the original to its place among the forgotten files. That night she added Anwin's case to her evidence wall, the centerpiece of a pattern that stretched back over 2 decades. Her apartment phone rang at 11:47 p.m., jolting her from her documentation work. When she answered, Dashiell Thorne's voice filled the room with barely contained menace. Court clerks should file papers, not wild accusations. Your reassignment was a courtesy. The next step won't be so gentle. Stop digging into things that don't concern you. Anwin hung up without responding and surveyed her apartment with new eyes. If they were threatening her directly, it meant she was getting close to something that truly scared them. Her invisible presence had finally been noticed by the very people who had spent years pretending she didn't exist. From a hidden compartment beneath her floorboards she removed a waterproof case containing backup drives and the most critical documents. Everything was still there, her true evidence cache untouched by their surveillance. Let them watch, let them threaten. She had been planning for this confrontation for 15 years, and she was ready. The invisible woman was about to remind them why shadows made the most dangerous enemy. The next morning brought an unexpected gift wrapped in bureaucratic irony. Due to what the court system would later call a clerical error, Anwin's workplace harassment lawsuit had been assigned to Judge Harrison Whitfield's docket. The same Judge Whitfield who was the target of her harassment complaint. The same Judge Whitfield who had unknowingly been paying her salary while she gathered evidence against him for 8 years. Anwin smiled for the first time in months as she reviewed the court schedule. She had managed that system for nearly a decade, understanding its complexities better than anyone. There had been no clerical error. Only 15 years of patient planning finally reaching its culmination. Her lawsuit was modest in scope, alleging workplace harassment related to her transfer to the basement archives. On paper it appeared to be the desperate complaint of a disgruntled employee seeking attention. In reality, it was the delivery mechanism for evidence that would destroy the most corrupt judge in Massachusetts history. The hearing was scheduled for Friday morning, 5 days to finalize her preparations and ensure every piece of evidence was in order. 5 days for Whitfield to continue believing he was untouchable. Federal prosecutor Imani Rhodes had been skeptical when Anwin first approached her 3 months ago. Their coffee shop meeting had been conducted with the careful paranoia of intelligence operatives. Rhodes obviously wondering why a court clerk would claim to have evidence of a massive corruption conspiracy. Why come to me with this? Rhodes had asked. Why not the State Ethics Committee or the DA? I tried the DA. He wasn't interested, Anwin had replied quietly. As for the Ethics Committee, 3 of its 5 members have direct connections to Judge Whitfield through campaign donations and legal partnerships. And what exactly do you want from me? I'm going to expose Whitfield publicly. When I do, I need someone ready to act on the evidence immediately. Rhodes had studied her carefully, recognizing something in Anwin's controlled demeanor that spoke of long-term planning and absolute determination. You understand the risks. Whistleblowers often find themselves destroyed in the process. I understand completely. After reviewing a sample of Anwin's evidence, Rhodes had provided her business card with a personal number written on the back. Call me when you're ready. I make no promises, but I'll look at what you have. Now, as Anwin made her final preparations, she knew Rhodes was already moving pieces into position. Federal agents were preparing arrest warrants. Asset forfeiture specialists were identifying Whitfield's offshore account. The wheels of justice, so long corrupted by money and influence, were finally beginning to turn. That evening she visited Anwin's grave one last time before the confrontation. The simple headstone bore only her sister's name and dates, nothing of who she had been or how she had died. It's almost over, Anwin whispered, placing fresh flowers by the stone.
Tomorrow he'll finally face what he's done. To you, to all of us. The trap was set. The prey would walk willingly into the courtroom, believing himself the predator. Justice, so long delayed, was finally at hand.
Friday morning arrived with a clarity Anwin hadn't felt in 15 years. She dressed with particular care, selecting clothing that subtly transformed her appearance. A slightly higher quality blazer, her hair arranged with a few strategic strands loosened from their usual severe style. Small changes that suggested the shedding of a carefully maintained disguise. The courthouse routine unfolded exactly as it had thousands of times before. Security guards nodded absently as she passed through metal detectors. Colleagues barely glanced up as she walked by. Even as she entered courtroom 3, where her case would be heard, no one paid attention to the unremarkable woman taking her seat at the plaintiff's table. Anwin sat alone, having declined legal representation. No attorney would risk their career for what she planned to do, and she needed complete control over how the evidence would be presented. The courtroom remained mostly empty, a few junior attorneys observing from the back, 2 court reporters expecting nothing newsworthy. Her case was clearly considered a minor nuisance, not worth senior lawyers' time. Precisely at 9:00 a.m., the bailiff called the room to order. All rise for the Honorable Judge Harrison Whitfield. Whitfield entered with his usual imperial bearing. His expression already set an impatient annoyance as he glanced at the docket. Callaway versus Court Administration, he read with thinly veiled contempt. Let's not waste the court's valuable time. Miss Callaway, you may present your case. Briefly, Anwin rose slowly, allowing herself to stand completely straight for the first time in 8 years. Her gaze was direct and unwavering, as she looked at the man who had killed her sister through willful negligence and judicial corruption. Your Honor, she began, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the courtroom. I would like to present evidence of systematic harassment and corruption within this court that directly relates to my workplace treatment. Whitfield's eyebrows rose slightly, mild irritation crossing his features. This case concerns workplace harassment, Miss Callaway. Please stick to those allegations. The harassment I've experienced is directly connected to my attempts to document judicial corruption. Your Honor, they cannot be separated. From her briefcase, Anwin removed a small flash drive. I'd like to submit this as Exhibit A. As Whitfield nodded impatiently, she connected the drive to the courtroom's evidence display system. The large screen flickered to life and the first image appeared. Security footage showing Whitfield meeting privately with defense attorneys in cases he was actively presiding over. The judge's expression shifted from boredom to sharp attention. What is the meaning of this? This isn't relevant to your harassment claim. On the contrary, Your Honor, Anwin replied with perfect calm. My reassignment to the basement archives, the reduction of my hours, and the threats I've received are direct consequences of gathering this evidence. She clicked to the next file. Bank records filled the screen, showing deposits to offshore accounts that correlated precisely with controversial case dismissals. Turn that off immediately, Whitfield ordered, rising slightly from his seat, his composure finally cracking. As an officer of this court, Anwin stated clearly, I have a duty to report judicial misconduct when I observe it. The courtroom had gone completely silent, all eyes fixed on the evidence unfolding before them. Exhibit B, Anwin continued with methodical precision, advancing to the next screen of evidence. Her voice remained steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. Financial records showing systematic correlation between case dismissals and deposits to Judge Whitfield's offshore account. The defense attorney jumped to his feet, his face flushed with panic. Your Honor, this is completely outrageous. This has nothing to do with the plaintiff's workplace harassment claim. On the contrary, Anwin replied before Whitfield could speak. Everything I've experienced in this courthouse connects directly to these matters. She turned to face the judge directly, her 15 years of invisible observation finally given voice. 15 years ago, you dismissed the domestic violence case of my sister Anwin Callaway. 6 months later, her husband killed her. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Several observers who had been only half listening suddenly sat forward, phones discreetly recorded. Bailiff, Whitfield commanded, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. Remove Miss Callaway immediately, and confiscate that evidence. The bailiff hesitated, his eyes moving between the judge and the damning evidence displayed on the screen where dozens of cases were listed, each corresponding with suspicious financial transactions. That would constitute obstruction of justice, Your Honor, Anwin said clearly. The FBI has copies of everything you see here. As if summoned by her words, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. 3 people in dark suits entered, displaying FBI credentials as they moved down the center aisle. Leading them was federal prosecutor Imani Rhodes. Judge Whitfield, Rhodes announced formally. We have warrants to seize evidence related to an ongoing federal investigation into judicial misconduct and racketeering. Whitfield's face had drained of all color. He stared at Anwin with the dawning recognition of a predator realizing he had been the prey all along. You, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You've been planning this. For 15 years, Anwin confirmed. After you dismissed my sister's case for $50,000, I changed my appearance, took my mother's maiden name, and began working in your courtroom. I needed to understand how the system protected men like you and Elliot Greenfield. The courtroom had filled beyond capacity now. Word was spreading through the courthouse, and reporters were pushing through the crowd. Court staff stood in doorways, watching with stunned expressions as their understanding of the past 15 years was completely rewritten. Your Honor, Rhodes said with professional formality, I strongly suggest you recuse yourself from this case immediately. Whitfield remained frozen, staring at Anwin as though seeing her for the first time in 8 years of daily interaction. You've been working with them all along. For the past year, she confirmed. But I've been working for justice much longer than that. As federal agents approached the bench with arrest warrants, Whitfield seemed to find some remnant of his former composure. He straightened his robes with practiced dignity, bringing down his gavel one final time. This court is in recess, he announced, but it was far too late. The evidence was public now, and justice could no longer be bought or buried. The arrest was swift and professional. Federal agents escorted Judge Harrison Whitfield from his own courtroom in handcuffs, his 30-year judicial career ending in the same chamber where he had denied justice to countless victims. Camera flashes exploded as news crews, alerted by courthouse staff, captured every moment of his fall from grace. Within hours, the story dominated every news outlet in Massachusetts. Federal investigation exposes judicial corruption, screamed the headlines, while legal experts struggled to comprehend the scope of the conspiracy that had operated in plain sight for decades. But Anwin's revelation was only the beginning. The evidence she had methodically gathered over 15 years didn't implicate just one corrupt judge. It exposed an entire network of complicity that reached into law enforcement, politics, and Boston's elite social circle. Dashiell Thorne, the defense attorney who had threatened her just weeks earlier, was arrested at Logan Airport attempting to board a private flight to the Cayman Islands. His luggage contained evidence of his role as the middleman between wealthy clients and corrupt judicial officials, including detailed records of payments made to ensure favorable ruling. Elliot Greenfield, now CEO of a major financial institution, was indicted on federal charges, stemming from his role in the money laundering operation that had funded judicial corruption for over 2 decades. The same man who had murdered Tamsin with his fists would now face justice for the financial crimes that had kept him free. 3 additional judges were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The scope of corruption extended far beyond Whitfield's courtroom, revealing a systematic perversion of justice that had operated with impunity because its victims were predominantly women seeking protection from domestic violence. Federal investigators found over 200 cases where domestic violence charges had been dismissed following suspicious financial transactions. Each dismissal had emboldened abusers and endangered victims, creating a trail of broken lives and, in too many cases, preventable death. Anwin testified before a federal grand jury for 6 hours, walking investigators through 15 years of meticulous documentation. Her evidence wall, photographed by FBI agents, became the foundation for prosecutions that would continue for years to come. How did you maintain such focus for so long? Asked the lead prosecutor during a break in her testimony. My sister died because the system failed her, Anwin replied simply. I couldn't let that failure continue without consequence. The impact extended beyond individual prosecution. Her revelations prompted legislative hearings on judicial oversight, leading to comprehensive reforms in how domestic violence cases were handled and monitored. Victim advocacy groups, long frustrated by systemic bias, finally had evidence to support their claims of institutional corruption. A week after Whitfield's arrest, Anwin received a call from Sorcha Parnell, whose case had been the final catalyst for her decision to act. I saw the news, Sorcha said, her voice filled with emotion. When I recognized you from the courtroom, I couldn't believe all those years you were watching, documenting, preparing to fight for people like me. People like us. Anwin corrected gently. This was never just about one corrupt judge. It was about changing a system that failed too many women to count. The invisible woman had stepped into the light, and the darkness she exposed was finally retreating. 2 months later, Anwin found herself in the most public setting of her life, a packed congressional hearing room, where senators and representatives had gathered to address the systematic failures revealed by her investigation. The mahogany-paneled chamber felt worlds away from the basement archives where she had spent countless hours building her case. "Callaway," began Senator Patricia Wells, chairwoman of the Judiciary Committee, "your investigation has exposed corruption that reaches into multiple federal judicial districts. In your opinion, what systematic changes are needed to prevent such abuse of power?" Anwin adjusted the microphone with steady hands, her voice clear and confident despite the dozens of cameras focused on her. "The problem isn't just individual bad actors, Senator. It's a system designed to protect its own, to silence victims, and to preserve institutional power at all costs." She gestured to the evidence folders stacked beside her chair. Judge Whitfield didn't operate in isolation. He was enabled by a culture of deference and a lack of meaningful oversight. When victims tried to report bias or corruption, they were when advocates raised concerns, they were marginalized. When I attempted to report misconduct through proper channels, I was demoted and threatened. Representative Mark Chen leaned forward. "What specific reforms would you recommend?" "Mandatory transparency for judicial finances, independent oversight bodies with real enforcement power, and victim advocacy representation in the judicial misconduct process," Anwin replied. "Most importantly, there must be consequences for willful blindness. Too many people in positions of authority chose not to see obvious patterns because acknowledgement would have required action." Her testimony lasted over 3 hours, covering not just Whitfield's specific crimes but the institutional failures that it enabled. She spoke about the domestic violence victims who had been silenced, the advocates who had been ignored, and the systematic bias that had pervaded the courts for decades. "Callaway," asked Senator Wells in conclusion, "what would you say to other potential whistleblowers who might be afraid to come forward?" Anwin considered the question carefully, thinking of all the people who had remained silent in the face of obvious corruption. "Fear is understandable. The system is designed to punish those who challenge it, but silence serves only those who benefit from injustice." She looked directly into the C-SPAN cameras, knowing her words would reach courthouses and government offices across the country. "If you have evidence of misconduct, document. If you witness corruption, record it. And when you're ready to act, know that there are people who will stand with you. Change is possible, but only if we refuse to accept the unacceptable." After the hearing, Anwin was approached by dozens of staffers, advocates and fellow whistleblowers. Her story had inspired others to come forward with evidence of corruption in their own jurisdictions, creating a nationwide reckoning with judicial misconduct. The invisible court clerk had become the visible face of judicial reform, her quiet determination transformed into a powerful voice for systematic change. As she left the Capitol building, Anwin reflected on how far she had traveled from the basement archives where her investigation had nearly been buried. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not with weapons or protests, but with patience, documentation, and the courage to speak truth to power. 1 year after the courtroom confrontation that exposed Judge Harrison Whitfield's corruption, Anwin Callaway stood in a very different kind of courtroom. The federal sentencing hearing was packed with domestic violence survivors, legal advocates and journalists, who had followed the case through months of trials and plea negotiations. Judge Whitfield, once the most powerful judicial figure in Massachusetts, sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his imperial bearing reduced to the hunched posture of a man facing the consequences of decades of corruption. His conviction on racketeering, money laundering and judicial misconduct charges carried a sentence of 25 years in federal prison. "Your Honor," Anwin said when invited to deliver her victim impact statement, Judge Whitfield's crimes extended far beyond financial corruption. His willingness to sell justice destroyed lives and enabled violence against vulnerable women who turned to the courts for protection. She looked directly at Whitfield, who refused to meet her eyes. "My sister Tamsin trusted the system to protect. Instead, that system sold her life for $50,000. She died believing that justice was possible, and I have spent 15 years proving she was right to believe that, even if it took far longer than it should have." The judge presiding over the sentencing was the Honorable Maria Santos, appointed to replace Whitfield and known for her commitment to transparency and reform. "Miss Whitfield," she said solemnly,
Your abuse of judicial power represents one of the most serious betrayals of public trust in this district's history. The sentence reflects not only your specific crimes but the systematic damage you inflicted on public confidence in our judicial system. After the sentencing, Anwin walked out of the courthouse to find a crowd of supporters waiting on the steps. Domestic violence survivors held signs thanking her for her courage. Advocacy groups had organized a rally celebrating the conviction and the broader reforms her investigation had prompted. Sorcha Parnell approached through the crowd, now working as a victim advocate herself. "I wanted to thank you again," she said, embracing Anwin warmly. "Not just for what you did for me, but for everyone who came after." "The work isn't finished," Anwin replied, gesturing toward the courthouse behind them. "Changing one corrupt judge was just the beginning. There are others who think they're untouchable, and victims who still need voice." 6 months after Whitfield's conviction, Anwin had founded the Anwin Callaway Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to judicial oversight and victim advocacy. The foundation's offices were located in a building overlooking Boston Harbor, where she worked with former colleagues who had reached out after the scandal broke to offer their support. Elliot Greenfield had been sentenced to 15 years for his role in the money laundering conspiracy. 3 other judges had been convicted on related charges. The systematic reforms Anwin had advocated for were being implemented across multiple judicial districts. On quiet evenings, she still visited Tamsin's grave, bringing updates on the progress being made in her sister's name. Justice was delayed, she would whisper to the simple headstone, but it was never denied. Your trust in the system was vindicated, just 15 years later than it should have been. The invisible woman had become visible not for recognition or revenge, but to ensure that no other sister would die believing justice was beyond reach. Some heroes work in shadows by choice, documenting injustice, while waiting for the perfect moment to step into the light. Their patience is their weapon, their invisibility their strength, and their dedication to truth their greatest victory over corruption and power.